Hi friends! Welcome to Growing as Grown-Ups, where we believe each of us has the opportunity to keep growing in ways that can fundamentally improve our life effectiveness, our leadership influence, and our well-being. Through interviews, stories, and practical principles, we explore how you can accelerate your growth and unlock your potential to make the difference you want to make. And now, your hosts from the Leaders Lyceum, Dr. Sarah Musgrove and Dr. Keith Eigel.
Welcome back to Growing as Grown-Ups, everyone. This episode is coming out on November 3rd, which if you live in the United States is Election Day. And we thought because this is such a big day in American society that we would take a little deviation from our normal podcast strategy where we've been interviewing leaders about their personal journeys and how they have grown through challenges and bring in Dr. Karl Kuhnert, who is a friend of both of ours, a colleague of ours, who has been a big influence in the work that we do, and also the co-author of the map along with you, Keith. And he is going to just have a conversation with you in this podcast that I think is going to be so great and so timely for people to just challenge them in the way they are thinking about the election and what is happening and all the division in the country. And I think it's a good way for our listeners to look at a challenge that they are facing right now in a new way and use just this election as an opportunity for growth.
Yeah, and I think we talk a lot about challenge and contradiction over time, and for, I don't know, maybe half the country, they are feeling or worried about challenge and contradiction that they don't want coming their way. And for the other half of the country, there may be some sort of a celebration like, hey, we won, but I think there's an opportunity for growth in both of us. And that's kind of what we structured the conversation around a little bit. Let me introduce Karl to the audience real quick. Karl was the chair of the Industrial Organizational Psychology Department, where we both got our degrees at Georgia. He was on the faculty there, Sarah, for 30 years. Five campus-wide teaching awards. Just a person of great influence in the system, in the area of leadership, his publications, his journal articles, all of these kinds of things. He retired from UGA after 30 years, and he is now a professor of the practice at Emory, but he has also gotten a professorship appointment in the psychiatry department at Emory as well. And Karl is not only a dear friend, he was also my major professor, which was just a total privilege for me to be sort of under his leadership. But then over the last, we were just counting, over the last 25 years, we've known each other for almost 30 years now, but over the last 25, we've been working together, helping grown-ups keep growing. And it was just such a treat to just sit down and have the kind of conversation that we so often have when we're just in the car driving somewhere together.
Yeah, I mean, it just really, there's just so much good stuff in your conversation. It was fun for me to get to listen to the two of you talk kind of like a fly on the wall and hear just the wisdom that you both share. One thing I do want to say to our listeners before we jump into that interview is that there is some reference in what you and Karl both say about something specific to our curriculum, about leader levels and the differences between the inside out and the outside in levels, and level 2, 3, 4, 5, which we haven't yet gone into detail on this podcast. And then Karl also references a different piece of our curriculum, which is where we really talk about the importance of curiosity and active listening and seeking to understand, which is a really level 5 mindset, but we can engage in that skill early on. And so I just want to say to our listeners, if this is stuff that's interesting to you, if you want to learn more, if you want to go deeper, we have a bunch of resources for you on our website. One thing I would really encourage you to think about is that we have just launched our online course it's called Challenge to Change, and it's about how to help you lean into the challenges that you are facing in life and change and grow and become more mature. And in that course, we cover both the leader level models and this active listening, curiosity, mindset, and practice. And so if this is something that you think would help also enhance your effectiveness as a leader and your growth, we'd really love for you to check that out. And if you sign up before the end of the year, we have a discount code for you. It is podcast50 for 50% off the enrollment cost of this class. And so check it out on our website, growinggrownups.com. And we'd love to get you in there and help you continue on your journey. So with that, let's just jump in and hear Keith's conversation with Dr. Karl Kuhnert.
Karl Kuhnert, what a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, it's great to be with you, Keith. And oh, by the way, when you set this up, I was thinking to myself, do you realize that it's been since March that we've seen each other?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not sure if in our entire tenure that we've ever gone 7 months.
No, I don't.
Without shaking your hand.
I know. This whole time has been crazy. For folks listening in, you may know this already, but Karl and I co-wrote a book together. But that was really the culmination of a lot of years of kind of teaching together and working together. And Karl was my major professor for the doctoral program up at UGA. Karl was a longtime faculty there, has retired and since gone to Emory. But we are coming up on 30 years of kind of focusing on leader levels and lens change and transformation and how do grown-ups grow in the context of leadership. And as this podcast airs, we're recording it actually about 3 weeks prior to the election, but it is going to air on election day, Karl. I thought it might just be fun. This is going to be a challenge for so many people. In some ways, the country seems kind of evenly split, right? And as polarized as I think it's ever been in my lifetime. And I think there's a relationship between where someone is on the developmental journey and how something like this actually winds up impacting them. So maybe over the course of the next 45 minutes, we can kind of get your take on some of this, talk a little bit about how we think this is going to impact people at different levels. I think just as importantly, what can they do to actually use this as a growth opportunity during this time? So as we come up on this season, Karl, what's your kind of overarching thought?
Yeah, well, I have been thinking about this, really since the pandemic. And what is really kind of really had me think deeply about this is that I actually went to the doctor yesterday for my annual physical, I call my 100,000 mile checkup, and and I asked him, I said, like, what's new for you here in your office? What are you seeing that's really different? And I could have predicted this. I should have predicted this, but he says, you know what I'm seeing a lot of? I'm seeing a lot of people coming in here with essentially chronic anxiety. And I said, is that's really new? He says, yeah. He says, there's a lot of, he says, I've been, I've been writing quite a few prescriptions for anti-anxiety medicine, more than I ever have in my career. And again, it shouldn't surprise us. I mean, right? I mean, we're 7-8 months into this pandemic now. It's sort of unrelenting and still raging through our country. We've also we've got the social injustice, which has really surprised, I think, a lot of people. I actually thought that many of these issues we had, if not behind us, at least not that far behind us. But as it turns out, we've got a lot more work to do. We've got 11 million people unemployed. The economy is not in great shape. And so for the doctor to say anxiety is the thing that he's seeing the most of, it doesn't surprise me. But this really, I think for me, it really impacts when we have this much anxiety, what it does, right? And what it does in organizations and what it does for institutions is it really limits the quality of communication people have with one another. I see, I think we're not as open with one another. I think it's hard to do the kind of things we're doing over Zoom. Relationships are really, it's hard to build new relationships, and and I think what happens is that, the Zoom, while it is convenient, a lot of what we need is more connection with each other, more dialogue. And I think all of this, this kind of the social isolation, we're certainly seeing this with our high school kids, our kids really struggling with being so isolated. So I think this is the context, right? This is the context in which leaders are trying to lead. And more than ever, and we'll get to this, more than ever, we need to have differentiated, level 4, level 5 leaders helping us get through this.
Yeah. Do you see, people have heard me talk about it in previous episodes of the podcast, and for those who have read the book, they get it. But how would you put into words what the relationship of this anxiety, the challenges that we're facing on so many fronts? Again, this is going to be airing on election day. And so there's going to be, I think, probably no resolution in terms of what I'm hearing right now, at least for a couple of days beyond when this thing airs, maybe much longer. But will you put into your own words kind of how someone at level 3, level 4, and level 5 sort of just the differences in the way you see them absorbing this kind of challenge?
Yeah. And as you know, I actually like to talk about this, and when we're doing our programs together, we talk about leader levels. But I find for most of the people I talk with about this, I really like to use the word maturity. And because we all kind of understand, and we all know leaders who are quite immature in the way they see themselves and others. And so what we desperately need are leaders that are more mature, and which we talk about as level 4, level 5. And by the way, I mean, just what this is, and my explanation of this, these are fundamental ways in which we see ourselves and others. This is on a continuum. And our growth, by the way, is really derived from the challenges and contradictions in our life. Our ability to learn from our mistakes, to learn from others, to get, when we get feedback from others, that we take these opportunities to really grow. And and part of me, and this is the really hopeful part of me, is in some ways, I'm not sure we really need a curriculum out of a book right now, because we're living in our life right now is the leadership curriculum. It's all in front of us, right? Yeah. It's all in front of us, and we have obstacles that we have to confront every day, and we have to decide whether we want to live into those and use that as an opportunity to learn, or we can, crawl up in a fetal position and just hope this thing gets over it someday soon, right?
Hatches, right? And just try and, muscle our way through it without really dealing with it.
Yeah. And the changes that are happening, Keith, and again, we talked about these social changes, but I have to tell you this, because I'm kind of knee deep in this whole artificial intelligence area now. And this is also very scary for people. I've never given a talk, Keith. This is fun. I don't think I've mentioned this to you, but I've never given a talk where, when I now talk about AI, people look at me and I can see they're interested, and then they look away. It's like they're scared, right? I don't want to hear this. Oh, that's interesting. No, I really don't. And so, this whole time we're going through, right? By the way, this pandemic, what it's doing is actually fueling change. The things, for example, that just one example is we have new classrooms at Emory that are what we call hybrid classrooms, where we have we can seat 30 people in the room. And then on the back of the wall is another 40 screens where people can zoom in, right? And what's so amazing is how this pandemic has sort of accelerated this change. I mean, you could always see this sort of change coming. But what's happened is we had a problem, right? We couldn't put, 70 people in a room together. And so we had to figure out how to do it differently. And in 6 months, we have a whole new way of teaching.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's like, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And it's just, this pandemic has accelerated change.
Yeah, it has. And I guess it's also in this way accelerated the opportunity for us to change as individuals as well. But we've got a little bit more sometimes control to sweep these things under the rug. I mean, the survival of the university is at stake right now, right? So there
are absolutely
ways that fundamentally are moving them in a direction. I want to follow up on just kind of your doctor's anecdotal diagnosis of the anxiety, the change in anxiety, chronic anxiety that he's seeing. And so often, Karl, we talk about this sort of outside inness of the lower levels of development, level 2 and level 3. But I would say that most of our audience between the ages of 25 and 50, I think more than half of them are still struggling or finding themselves in a place of sort of outside inness, being done to, almost a victimhood. And I'm wondering, you and I both know that one of the things that we begin to see at the more mature levels, to use the word that you just used a moment ago, that there is more sense and ownership of self. And I'm wondering, do you believe that there is less anxiety at the higher levels because it's not so determined by these really deeply shifting circumstances that are surrounding us?
Oh, that's, yes. We have some recent data on this, and it's absolutely true that the more mature leaders are actually less stressed, have less anxiety at this point, because they actually see this. They actually see this time as an opportunity. And there are people, by the way, I mean, there are companies who are actually doing better now as a result of the pandemic.
Right.
And I mean, there are people who see this again as an opportunity to really change things, to accelerate change, to predict where their business is going.
Yeah.
Right. Where are my customers going to be in? Well, they've changed in 6 months. Where are they going to be in the next 6 months? And how do I meet them? How do I meet these new customers in terms of what they need?
Yeah.
And so this is it's very true. The level, we talk about the more immature leaders, the level 3, level 2, for them, it's really all about the noise. It's all about everything happening around them. And what's happening is they're getting pulled in so many different directions, which in part is creating the anxiety. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really, this is the time where I think the best leaders stand up, right? Leaders actually serve as an immune system for their institutions.
Go a step with that. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, no, they are. They're there to help make sense and actually point to where the signals are, not to be caught by the noise that's surrounding all this pandemic and stuff. And so, what's important here,
right?
And being able to again know what the signal is and what the noise is what great leaders are able to do, right?
Yeah. So what is the thing that so often we've talked about this on our programs as the weather, right? The noise, these things outside of us that we don't have control of, but that sort of either creates instability for us, right? Especially from a more outside in view of the world, where you're allowing all this noise and all this weather to disrupt our status quo, right? I mean, I think that's where the anxiety comes from, is that we're feeling like we don't know what's ahead of us, and if the weather keeps getting worse, am I going to be okay?
Right.
What is what's your take on what folks can do who find themselves even recognizing in themselves this anxiety that they're feeling, to say sense of victimhood is maybe too strong of language, but it's in that neighborhood.
No, I agree with that. And again, okay, we can, bring this back to the election, right?
Yeah.
How many people do you hear nightly on the news blaming someone else for what's happening? As you mentioned, we've got a divided country, right? And this divide is not talking to each other.
Yeah,
right?
it goes back to one of your early comments that we're not communicating.
No, we're not. And I read this book a few years ago, and it's always kind of struck me. This guy was a social biologist. His name is E.O. Wilson, and of all things, he studied ants, and he was able to, and he did it in a very persuasive way. Talk about how ant communities are just like human communities. And he says, if you want a community, and he's talking about, he was literally referring to the United States here. He says, if you want the characteristics of an enduring society, they have to have cooperation, they have to have cohesiveness and altruism. And I look around and again, what I hear on the news is none of those things.
Right.
Right. That's what frightens me.
Yeah.
Is where is the cooperation? And it was striking, during the pandemic, right? We couldn't get people to share, face masks in this country, right? It was like hospitals were hoarding things and states were hoarding things. I'm like, where's the cooperation? There's very little cohesiveness, and the altruism. And it was interesting where we saw altruism. Where I saw it and where I felt like, wow, we're probably not as bad off as I think we are. Is when we saw these first responders, right? And what they were doing, and the hours and hours these physicians were putting in, much to their own, literally to their own health. They're doing these things, and it was just remarkable to see not only what the first responders were doing. It was also remarkable to see, like in New York, right? People opening their windows and clapping for staff changes at the local hospital, right? It was awesome, right? And I kept thinking, I said, wow, we need this on a national level, right? We need to have this. We need to, and again, I see this as, again, a great potential for us. I think these those three things, again, cooperation, cohesiveness, and alteration, are strong characteristics of level 5 leaders, the most mature leaders.
Yes.
Try to bring that out in others.
Right. So we often talk about level 5 as being the ability to sort of rise above the different points of view, right? To still hold a point of view on your own, but to see the value and the importance of another's point of view, even in helping refine your own. But there is this sort of umbrella of values that embrace things like collaboration, cohesiveness, and community in a way where we are recognizing what we have in common, recognizing the things that bind us, right? We so often talk
Right.
about things like Abraham Lincoln's "A house divided cannot stand," and MLK Jr.'s "We're all part of the same fabric of destiny," and this rising above this level 5 view of things goes beyond the polarization, but actually starts to knit the polarized sides into a more cohesive whole.
Yeah.
And yet, if we are identified by one of the poles at these earlier levels, if how we understand ourselves, others, and the world is defined by one party or the other party in terms of the political scene that we're in right now,
Yeah.
then if our identity is there, if our actual being and the way we know ourselves is there, then when there is a loss, we are essentially losing. I mean, our very being is tied to the outcome of this election.
Right.
In a country that is really close to divided 50-50, and it feels to me like 25 or 30% are way out on the edges of the poll.
Right. All right.
On either side, 25 or 30% on either side. So the majority of the country is out there. I mean, this creates a real dilemma for us if we can't figure out how to either begin growing ourselves through it, use this as an opportunity to grow through it, or if we don't get some higher level leadership in that can begin to knit this thing back together. I don't know what your reaction to that little monologue was.
No, I completely agree, Keith. I think the real challenge, sort of post-election,
Mm-hmm.
the day after this airs, is this is democracy, right? I mean, one of the things we know about democracy, is that there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. And what I would like to see happen, and again, let's just take the winners for a second. I would like the winners to take a breath, right? And say to themselves, okay, what are the truths that our side is neglecting, that the other side brought up? Right? Again, like your examples of Lincoln, what is the whole here? The whole is not your side winning. The whole is the house, right?
Yeah.
And we have to figure out how to mend the house, how to heal the house.
Yeah.
And we don't do that. We don't do that by claiming, and this is what's going to happen, is that we have a mandate, so we're going to just shove our stuff, and it's going to be, nothing will have changed, right? And we're still going to have half the country disaffected. And so the first thing that the winners need to do here is really reach out and deal with the things that are central to the anxieties, if you will, of the people who lost.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that's the answer. I agree that that's the answer. I think a sense of despair washes over me from time to time when I think about the likelihood of that happening.
Well, again, I mean, this is where, again, this is where leadership comes in.
Yeah.
Let me go real, go real micro for a second and underscore that, these values of cooperation, cohesiveness, altruism, those are not something that you have. It's something that you are. And I actually, this is a practice for me. I'm in a lot of meetings. I'm engaged in in discussions and debates where I often find myself in the minority, and it's I in the mid actually I actually do this is I will go either after a meeting or before the meeting. I will ask myself the question, am I willing to be cooperative here? What am I being cooperative here? And what I do is I actually force myself to reckon with my values before I go into these meetings. All right, I'm trying to practice the very things that I'm talking about here,
Right.
which is living into those values.
Yeah. So let's give folks who are listening to this let's build on what you just said there.
Yeah.
And what are the things that people can do when they know that they're going to be taking a walk with a friend, having a conversation with somebody that they know is potentially doesn't see things the way that they do, maybe even be in some level of disagreement with them. I love this idea of actually intentionally naming what you're saying in a way is the kind of person you want to be.
Right.
Altruism, this collaboration, this cooperation, reminding myself that I want to be bigger than the side, that the truth is in a more connected place than it probably is completely identified with either pole. So what are the things that people can do, remind themselves that are going to lead to growth in a time like this? I think listening well is part of the answer, but
You're right.
take it for
Let me just to take your point, Keith. And I have to tell you, let me put a plug in for you and Sarah here. Is the program that you do with design thinking got me to think more about being more curious in conversations, and I saw the real power of that, and that. And so what I'm now doing in most conversations, I have to work at this. It's not something that comes naturally to me, but I have to be more curious in what they're saying, and going a kind of the extra step in listening in a way that shows that I'm curious about them and what they have to say. Because part of what I'm always trying to do when I'm in a conversation is trying to find out more about that person and what's important to them. And so anyhow, so that listening, I think curiosity.
Yeah, curiosity.
In listening is really fantastic.
Yeah. What do you, when you go in and do that, what do you feel like, how are you preparing yourself to stay in that curious mode? Because in so many conversations that we have, just conversations at work, conversations around problem solving, we are preparing our response even as the other person is still finishing what they're saying.
Yeah.
So what do you have to do to actually stay in that curious space for you personally, Karl? What do you?
What I have to do is I have to remind myself, right? I mean, I literally remind myself that if I'm not being curious, if I'm not in that conversation, and the thing is, these conversations tend to be a little longer when I'm curious, but what I end up finding is they're much more beneficial.
Yeah.
Right. And this is hard, right? Because I've got other things to do, and I want to get, and again, it's part of the pace of life, right? Is that, we're not taking the time to really reflect. And again, that's a big part of this, Keith, is reflecting more on what you're doing.
Yeah.
While you're doing it. And, my second thing here, and, man, it just, again, we grow through challenge and contradiction, and the hardest thing for me over the years, and I finally think I've outgrown the problem. I didn't solve it, but I've outgrown it, which is this kind of need to be right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, it's so bad because, like I'll get in an argument or something, and all of a sudden it's completely ego driven, right? And that's the problem is I've got to be egoless in these conversations. And when I am, I'm very ego involved. And so therefore I got to win. And that winning is so counterproductive.
Oh,
Because then we end up, arguing extremes and then, eventually, you've done this enough. You realize that if you go down this path, that your next action is going to be an apology, right? I mean, you just know. And so, and my joke has been one of the greatest things about getting older is I no longer feel the need to be right. So giving up that right to be right.
yeah.
And again, that just takes us.
And so let me contextualize this just a little bit in the leader levels model, which is what the book, The Map, is about, right? Is about this journey from this outside in. It is protecting this identification that we are just subject to in a way, right? It's just it's doing something to us, and the real developmental, the growth-oriented challenge is to ask ourselves the questions like, who do I want to be in the middle of this? What's the story I want to tell? What am I learning new about me in this? And questions that drive toward a more inside-out answer. But there are also people listening to this podcast that have been inside out for a long period of time. They know who they are. We call them level 4 leaders or level 4 sense makers, there's this kind of groundedness. I've decided where I am, but when we decide where we are, we believe that's the right way to be, right? And that's where the rightness comes from. And in order to keep growing from that position, I've got to give up the right to be right. It's not saying that I'm going to be wrong, but I've got to loosen my grip on my rightness. And you and I often talk when we are with groups, we talk about people who don't grow in that way are the cranky old people that we meet, right? They're the ones who have doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on their way. And again, which only creates the polarization. And the best thing we wind up doing, Karl, is from that position, the best thing we do is we wind up managing our differences. Exactly. Right? Let's agree to disagree. But there's no taking it to a higher level.
Correct.
For folks who know that they are in that situation where they know what they hold to be true, folks, the opportunity for growth in that environment is to begin to loosen your grip, not give it up, but loosen your grip on your rightness, to give up to some degree the right to be right. And Karl, that opens the door for curious listening.
That's right.
And you made a comment that I have to prepare myself that it's going to take longer to stay in this place of curiosity. But don't you believe that that's ultimately, in the short run, way less time spent on this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's because it's also it's in the long term, it's actually more efficient.
Yeah.
And that it seems counterintuitive. Because if I'm spending more time here, how am I going to catch this time up later? And what happens is it does, because communication is much better. And, things get dealt with earlier. I mean, it's just over time, you'll find that taking the time to listen and to be curious pays dividends.
Yeah. So over the next days, weeks, or months, folks, what we can do to keep growing as grown-ups, regardless of our place on the journey, I think,
right,
is that we could actually take responsibility for deciding, I want to explore how the other's perspective makes sense to them, right? I want to stay curious with you long enough that I now have this sort of aha about how you're making sense of the world. It's like, oh my gosh, I get it now. Because so many of the people that we love, that we hang out with, that we're related to, we know them to be good sense makers in so many areas of their lives, right? But when it comes to a point of disagreement, it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. But what if we took responsibility, right? Because that's all we can take responsibility for. We can't make them take responsibility. We can invite them to, but we can't make them. But what we can take responsibility for is ourselves, and decide that we're going to be curious listeners and to try and understand where they're coming from. And, you know, I don't want to get on too big of a soapbox about this, but there have been times that I've wanted to, like I have some kind of control over this, but just sort of, you know, bolt the doors of the nation's capital and say, you're not allowed to come out unless you can tell me exactly how the other makes sense of their position.
Yeah.
And don't you know, a larger whole would emerge from that. And we can create that larger whole amongst ourselves.
Boy, that's well said, Keith. You know, we know that the most effective leaders, the most mature leaders, take more rather than less responsibility for things around them. And while that's easy to say, you know, an example that we've used frequently is that there's always someone in any office that you would rather not see or not deal with, right? That would rather duck into the bathroom in the hallway than meet this person, even though they're in the same company. Mm. And the challenge here is, can you be more rather than less responsible for that relationship? Because you know that the strength of the company actually in some ways depends upon your relationship with people you don't know as well. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's a real challenge, but that, and that, you know, that would be so, it's so important. Again, you know, for the winners of this election is to now be responsible for the whole, that is for the country.
Yeah.
Right. And what a challenge that would be to say that, look, this is our responsibility here, is to mend this country. And what's it going to take?
Yeah, and so we can wish that at the national level, right? But I think the thing that is so powerful in what you're saying is that most of us are part of a family unit. Most of us in the who are engaged in the community are part of a friend group. Most of us who work in an organizational setting or even volunteer in that setting are part of a team, right? If we're part of that organization, at the next level, we're part of the company or the whole organization or the larger community. And then you can begin to scale that up, that we're also members of our state, our country.
Sure.
And if you want to just go ahead and push it out, we're citizens of the world.
Right.
Right. So as we don't need to wait for the winner of the election to do this. We can take responsibility for more rather than less, and not wait for the other person to do that. We can take responsibility for that in our family or our friend group.
Oh, absolutely.
Or for crying out loud, in a single relationship with another person.
Yeah. No, it's funny. I have a colleague at Emory, and we talk quite frequently, and she's a family therapist, and we're using the same language, whether it's family dynamics or organizational dynamics, right? And so the very things that we're talking about here clearly apply to families, teams, institutions, organizations, wherever people are together, right? And to be effective, the same principles of course of mature leaders apply.
Yeah. And I think the thing that we need to bump up against is worry, fear, or resistance that we have, that we may lose something if we stay curious, allow ourselves to go down the road of their position, understanding them in a new way. I think that's the thing we need to bump up against, is that what's going to happen. You know, one of the things I've encouraged people to do, Karl, and this is maybe a different way of being curious without putting yourself at risk that the other person may, I don't even know what, convince you of something you didn't want to be convinced of. I don't know what it is, but it's like, if you're a Fox News person, how scary would it be to just listen to CNN every other day for a couple of weeks? If you're a CNN kind of person,
Sure.
and I'm just using those as kind of examples that to me seem to represent the two poles. How scary would it be to watch Fox News every other day for a week or two in a spirit of curiosity to see if you can understand how are they making sense of this? And as I begin to understand that, does that change me in any way? So I'm not picking a side here. I'm just saying that you and I both know that what the research shows is that the people who continue growing into these higher levels of understanding, this is kind of what they do naturally.
Yeah.
Right? They have curiosity of the other side. They recognize that there is a larger whole that exists above the positions.
Exactly. Yeah. 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 And we've talked about this, but we've got this kind of a herd mentality right now, that you're part of a herd, right? And, it could be the Democrat herd or the Republican herd or independent, whatever that herd is. And what it does is it actually prevents, right? It actually prevents herds from talking to one another. Right. And I'm not sure I want to go this far, but I'm going to say it anyhow, is that what it actually feels like is that the leader of these herds are the least mature who are running the herds. Right. And what happens is much of our conversation has been debased or has been minimized, and we end up in a place where the only thing that matters is winning.
Yeah. Yeah. So, our side winning.
Yes.
And there does appear to be almost an immaturity that doesn't make sense. A lot of times for the identified leaders on both sides. I mean, surely there are exceptions, and I know that there are exceptions to that. Karl, you made this quote by heart, right? Because we've talked about it before, but this so reminds me of Martin Luther King's quote. Do you know it by heart? Because I
go ahead. Yes, but go ahead.
I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other.
I mean, you couldn't nail it better today. And he said that in 1957.
Yeah.
Think about this.
Iowa, October 15th, 1962. Not to correct.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I thought it was 57. Okay, 62.
Yeah, October 15th. He may have said it several times, actually, but October 15th, 1962 at Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa. But I'm sorry, this is what we've been saying for the bulk of this conversation is
absolutely
this separation. And I guess here's the thing. Again, this is airing on election day. I think it's going to be potentially, from what I've heard, days, weeks, or months before we understand the outcome, unless something happens where it landslides one way or the other. We can live into the solution ourselves.
Absolutely.
We can encourage that happens at a collective, community, global, whatever level. But as we grow as grown-ups, we can take responsibility for this literally this afternoon, literally tomorrow, we can decide that we are going to not be separated, that we are going to communicate, that we are going to know, with the hope and belief that that will dispel the hate. And boy, Karl, that's growth.
That's growth.
That's huge growth.
Right. And I'll just say this, that if you're not doing this, if you're not reaching out, you are part of the problem. Right? You know, some people respond to this carrots and some people respond to the stick. This is a stick. You are part of the problem.
Yeah.
And I encourage people that there's a lot at stake here.
Let's say this in this way, Karl. When we don't reach out,
that's right,
we are part of the problem.
Right.
Oh man. That is,
it prevents, what it does though, it prevents what we want, which is a solution to, you know, what we're separated over.
So might we in the coming days, weeks, months, take responsibility to be part of the solution at whatever level we have influence, right? I mean, this is, I think, the takeaway. And Karl, I can't even tell you, we're drawing to a close here in terms of time, but just thank you so much for the conversation. Doing this in this format with you, it feels like a lot of the drives we've taken in cars together when we, but to kind of formalize it in this. Yeah.
This is pretty far from a performance.
A treat for me though. And thank you for just carving out time, knowing that this is the day that this thing is going to air on. And I just so grateful for my relationship with you, and look forward to maybe a couple of more of these kind of conversations in this environment.
Hey, well, thank you, Keith. You know, your friendship means a lot to me, and it's been wow, a great 30 years together. Although I do resent the fact that you look so much younger than I do. But other than that, I really appreciate our friendship. Hey, be safe. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual, and we will look forward to talking again soon.
Look forward to it, Keith. Thank you.
Thank you.
Keith, that was such a great conversation with Karl, and I think it was such a great example of this level 5, this more mature way of understanding the world that I just don't think we get to hear enough of, at least in the media and in the big public conversations that we're having about these topics. And one thing that just really struck me was through both you and Karl and your take on what's going on in the election and what our country needs is this idea both of rising above differences instead of taking sides in the polarity of winners and losers that comes with a democracy, of saying, let's rise above and let's find the commonalities. And in the challenge that Karl threw out there of, if you are not reaching out and trying to understand the other, you are part of the problem. And it's like, oh man, right? So often we want to say they are the problem. They are arguing and blaming and all this stuff. But I think about even in my family, the differences and the tensions that exist of, you know, there are people very strongly on both sides of the line in my family. And I just think, when have I gone to one of those people and said, help me understand why you feel so passionate about this thing? And it's like, okay, I must be part of that problem because I'm not trying to bridge those gaps. And so I just thought that was a great challenge. And I would encourage our listeners to think about that for themselves, right? This idea that one of you said it, the most mature leaders take more rather than less responsibility for the things around them. And it's like, this is a hard time to do that, but it is what we need to do.
Yeah. And it requires, that we really put our own perspective on the shelf for just a minute and really get curious with other people. And not only is that a higher level of being together, right? Not only is it more mature from a sense-making perspective and the way that we've talked about it in leader levels and all of this kind of stuff, but it's also a way to grow ourselves, Sarah. And this is the Growing as Grown-Ups podcast. And so I hope people will take the challenge to be part of the solution. You're going to take a walk. You're going to have a conversation with people. You're going to talk to family. And as we said during the podcast, it could be days, weeks, or longer before we know the outcome. And the country's in tension. There's challenge. Surely there's challenge right now, right? And challenge is an opportunity to grow. So glad I got to have the conversation with Karl, and I hope folks enjoyed it.
Yeah. And just a reminder again, if you want to go deeper and learn how to apply this stuff in your own life and accelerate your growth, check out our Challenge to Change course at growinggrownups.com and get some more resources and tools to help you have these difficult conversations and become these more mature leaders that we've been talking about.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Growing as Grown-Ups. Take a second and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes, and tell your friends. You'll find all of the goods related to this episode, including the transcript, videos, links, and other ways we can help you keep growing as a grown-up on our website, growinggrownups.com. Growth isn't easy, but it's completely within your reach. Until next time, journey well, friends.